Colleagues, welcome this afternoon to what I hope will be a lively discussion on a matter of immense interest throughout our conference this week, the Tertiary Education Commission, one of the major recommendations of the Accord. I'm Francis Campbell and I'm moderating the discussion. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Notre here in Australia. I'm joined by a very distinguished panel that I don't think needs a major introduction to this audience, but we have Tony Cook, the Secretary in the Department for Education. We then have Andrew, the Professor of Higher Education Practice at ANU, and then we have Craig, who's the CEO of the Victorian Skills Authority. Now, the way we're going to use this valuable hour is very shortly we're going to hear from Tony for about 7 to 10 minutes from the podium, where he's going to just remind us of what the Accord says about the Tertiary Education Commission. And then I'm going to pass to Andrew and to Craig for 5 to 7 minutes each on a response or their views on what they see as the major worker challenges or perhaps opportunities of the Tertiary Education Commission. And then we might have a panel discussion back and forward. We might put Tony on the spot a little bit because, after all, he's now leading the department that has to make sense of the Accord and indeed deal with a lot of the implementation. Now, colleagues, can I remind you of the conference app? And we have the time for you, probably about 30 minutes of this session, to pose questions to the panel. You can vote on other people's questions, and as you vote, the more popular questions, as you will recall from other sessions, move further up the agenda, and that's how we'll get a hierarchy of questions. So thank you very much, and without further ado, Tony, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Francis, and can I begin, of course, by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting here today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and also other families have connection to the ACT lands. Can I also acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us here today, either online or in the audience. I thought I'd start by just reminding you all, as Francis said, about the recommendations that are in the Accord. I'm sure you've all read the report. Here it is, 400 pages. An incredible amount of work, 820 public submissions. Thank you very much for those people that actually took the time to provide submissions, to do anything in relation to response to the interim report. All important work that Mary and the panel utilised in their final report that was delivered to government a couple of months ago, but as you know, released on Sunday. Just to be clear, while I was originally on the panel for a couple of months, I wasn't on the panel for the end in terms of my new role as a secretary, and so it's not my report, just so that you all know that. My job is to assist the government to respond to the report. For those people that don't know, there's also this version, which is 30 pages long. You might want to have a look at this one if you're a bit time poor for this one. This is on the department's website as well, which is a summary version of the full report. But I would recommend, if you do get the chance to read the full report, there's a lot of in-depth recommendations and views on every single page. So if you get a chance, thoroughly recommend you have a read of it. The report, as you know, covers a range of areas. It covers everything from basically a new tertiary objective through to what we might do to get greater participation of students from underrepresented areas into higher education, through to funding models, through to international education, through to research, through to something that we're talking about today, which is the Australian Tertiary Education Commission. You'd also be aware there were roughly 47 recommendations, but under those 47 recommendations, there were a number of sub-recommendations. Recommendation 30, which is the recommendation in relation to ATEC in itself, went for almost 2 pages. And so there's a breadth of information, there's a breadth of suggestions and recommendations being made to government about the form of what tertiary education should look like into the future. You'll note I'm using the word tertiary. The panel did talk about an Australian Tertiary Education Commission, not a Higher Education Commission, and I'll talk about that briefly as I go through over the next couple of minutes. In terms of the recommendations, the panel had a strong view that their recommendations would assist in what they were trying to achieve in relation to the targets that they have set in their report. And I'm sure you don't need me reminding, but just to take you through what they were: increasing the tertiary education attainment rate from 60% to at least 80% of Australians in our workforce by 2050, increasing the proportion of university-educated Australians aged 25 to 34 from 45% to 55% by 2050, and increasing the number of 25 to 34-year-olds with a tertiary level vocational or technical qualification to 40% by 2050. I know people have already reflected on some of those targets and have some views about the feasibility or otherwise of that. And I know, Andrew, you've made some comments about some of these things as well. They've also made the recommendation that really I'm here to give a brief overview of this afternoon, which is the recommendation in relation to ATEC itself. So the panel does recommend that there's an independent statutory authority called the Australian Tertiary Education Commission, and that basically that authority reports to two ministers: the Minister for Education, the Federal Minister for Education, and also the Federal Minister for Skills and Training. There's also commentary in the report about, in time, the Tertiary Education Commission have some engagement with state governments as well, particularly as the initial idea from the panel is that we focus predominantly on higher education, with some things around AQF and other areas in relation to better alignment between VET and higher education, but that in time, the notion of tertiary becomes more focused and that there's more work that happens around the VET sector more broadly, which may require engagement with state governments, including the funding that state governments provide, but also that the work that they do at the state level around vocational education and training, including the new national agreement that was signed not so long ago. The panel saw the Commission acting as a convening body for planning the future of tertiary education. I'll talk about that in a little while as well, providing expert advice to government and potentially, as I said, to governments into the future, including state governments, and advising on meeting the skills and equity targets that the panel has proposed to the government itself. In terms of the vision, it's a fairly ambitious plan that the final report outlines that the panel has developed. And it's really about looking at the shifts required in the Australian tertiary sector between now and 2050, which is when they anchor being able to achieve some of those targets that they set. It talks about meeting the skills needs of the nation, expanding participation in higher education, leveraging our national research capacity and capability, and also a range of other things that the panel has come up with in their 47 recommendations. One of the major priorities you'll see is the word stewardship comes up a lot, with the view that ATEC, or the Commission, takes that stewardship role. If you've read the report, there's a section that talks about effectively over successive years and successive decades, the capacity of governments, including the capacity of departments like mine, doesn't actually provide the sort of stewardship, the advice, the rigour that governments need to enable us to meet the outcomes and the objectives that we want for tertiary education. And so one of the questions I guess that people might have is, well, who's going to be in this ATEC? Who are these people? That will be a matter for government as government considers this recommendation over the coming months. They also make it clear that they believe the role of the Commission will be to a strong convener, bringing business together with the tertiary education sector, with unions, with employers, to continually talk about the future of education. And they talk about a rolling triennial strategy to enable the Commission to do that. And again, I'll talk about that in a little while. So in terms of the guts of it, this is really it. So here's the range of functions that the panel proposes that the ATEC would undertake. I've already talked about stewardship, a very strong focus on stewardship, basically informed by strong engagement with the sector, but also other important stakeholders as business, to plan the future for tertiary education and to continuously do that through a rolling triennial report, including the case for new public universities in underserviced areas, or tertiary education providers which specialise to a greater or lesser extent in teaching or research. A very strong focus, as you can see there, around tertiary alignment, around enhancing tertiary alignment to deliver skills growth through stronger connections between VET and higher education more broadly. A role for this commission to monitor sector performance, including against new targets in skills and equity and through mission-based compacts negotiated between the commission and higher education providers. Advising on and assisting in designing regulatory policy through working closely with TEXA, and you'll see in my next slide, I think I've got, or maybe the one after, a view that from the panel that TEXA becomes part of the commission, still independent, still its own legislation, and the TEXA Chief Commissioner becomes a commissioner of ATEC. Part of the role of commission is also looking at minimising regulatory burden as part of that, looking at the regulatory framework more broadly. The funding policy and pricing component there, that the Commission will have a role in looking at pricing, including ensuring that there's a better understanding about how much it costs to deliver specific courses of study at institutions and across the sector at large, and also including a new student needs-based funding model, where student characteristics are included in potential funding models into the future for higher education. I've talked about engagement already, but regular engagement with the sector, including a focus on First Nations self-determination on matters relating to First Nations people in the tertiary education system, and continuous improvements in data collection, data capability, including more timely and granular data provision and greater analysis and dissemination of this data. That's in their first week. As you can imagine, this is substantial, and there's a lot of work that would be proposed if the government accepts the recommendation in relation to ATEC. In addition, the panel also recommended some specific strategies for the Commission, such as the Commission having a role in developing a national research workforce development strategy, that there would be an annual State of the Tertiary Education System report tabled in Parliament, which would include reporting on progress against national targets, and then a future of the tertiary education sector report, which is a rolling triennial report which would outline emerging issues in the higher education sector, forecasting supply and demand of places, looking at gaps between the sector's current state and where it needs to be to meet future needs as well. And as I mentioned, the suggestion from the panel is that the Commission would initially focus on higher education predominantly, but move towards a more tertiary focus over the coming years. And just to finish up very quickly, if you've also looked at the report, you would see that they've got a suggested structure for the ATEC, or for the Tertiary Education Commission, and that's a bit of an overview about what that would look like. So basically the recommendation proposes an ATEC board, which is up the top there. It would be made up of a Chief Commissioner, 2 Deputy Commissioners, the TEXA Chief Commissioner and the ARC Board Chair, a First Nations Commissioner, an Equity Commissioner, and the Regional Education Commissioner, which many of you will be aware is a position that already exists. TEXA and ARC would come into ATEC and be part of ATEC, but they remain as independent statutory bodies, and each chair would become a commissioner, but retain their legislated role which currently exists. The panel also recommended that underneath the board there were then 3 councils, an ongoing advisory board, with representatives from tertiary education providers, Australian governments, student, staff, employees, unions, civil society more broadly, a First Nations Council to bring the First Nations leadership and advice and advice on a self-determined approach to matters relating to First Nations people in the tertiary education sector, and a Learning and Teaching Council to focus on best practice learning and teaching approaches, taking into account the changes in relation to global education and technology, and that they would propose that the Commission itself would be reviewed every 5 years. So that's a very quick synopsis I get of what's in the report. Obviously Rec 30 there, and there's a whole chapter in the report as well if you're after more detail about what's been proposed for the Commission itself. Thanks, Francis.
Andrew.
So the final Accord report did not convince me that the proposed system would be better than going back to some version of the previous demand-driven system, but it did persuade me that the suggestions were, I think, a lot more practical and attractive than what I was imagining based on the Accord interim report last year. And in particular, I think they have backed away from prescriptive allocation of places to courses to meet skills needs, which I think would have ended in paralysis and chaos, alternatively, while they try to adapt to that. But there will still be a control on the total size of the university, and in my view, that's a major change to the level of strategic autonomy that universities have. But of course, it's needed to try and meet the big attainment targets. There are elements which I'm pretty keen on, which has already been mentioned, which is this State of the System report. If you go back to the old commissions we used to have in the 50s, 60s and 70s, they would produce hundreds of pages of report, really detailed analysis of what was going on in the sector, 100 times better than anything we have today. And I think that would be very, very helpful. But I do have a lot of practical concerns about it. And one's already been sort of alluded to a bit with Tony, which is who will actually staff this Tertiary Education Commission? The report acknowledges there's actually a lack of expertise in higher education policy in this country. So we're starting from a relatively low base. And I think if we do something like we did with TEXA a decade or so ago, where we tended to bring in people with generic public service skills rather than people with experience in the sector, we will hit problems. So I really think we need to think carefully about the staffing profile, probably try to recruit people from university planning offices who are very familiar with all the practical details of managing student load and applications and offers and all these things. The Commission will be very reliant on having high quality data. As many of you would know, the TEXI system has had troubles over the last few years. I think it's better now, perhaps Tony will know more. But can this system be relied upon to inform the work of the Commission? Because we'll actually need a lot of additional work, because at the moment we actually only sort of tag a handful of enrolments as headed towards a particular occupation. But if we want to look at the skills pipeline, we need to have a far more sophisticated idea of what's coming through the system. And having tried to do this with this data set myself a number of years ago, it's not straightforward, particularly in the universities which enrol you in a very general sounding degree. You really got to infer what they're doing from the subjects they're taking. So that's quite a complex task to do. And there's this huge risk that if the IT system collapses, the whole system will freeze. I think the growth targets that universities will have will also create new practical and data issues. So as far as I know, there is no national repository of university infrastructure that says, these are the buildings we have, this is the capacity they're in, this is their state of repair. Can we physically put more students into this university? We do have a staff data collection, but I think it's probably too high level to actually say, well, do we have the staff with the right expertise to teach all the extra students that we do want to have? So I think even being quite optimistic about our capacity to solve these problems, it's going to take a couple of years at least to get this organisation to the point where we're confident it can do the things that I think it's been asked to do by this final report. And in this, when I was talking about these issues last year, I was talking about the issue of what I call single point of failure systems. That if there's a single decision maker who can't make a decision because the IT system has collapsed, or is very slow in making them because they can't recruit the staff, what happens? Is there a backup plan? I think the final issue is that even though this is clearly better than what I thought it would be from last year's interim report, we still have the danger that the Commission in practice will be more interventionist than was envisaged. And again, we've got an analogy of what happened with TEXA a decade or so ago. And I think a recent example in a more similar space, which was the previous government's job-ready graduates policy, had one really good feature, and that was that they basically combined 3 pots of money for sub-bachelor, bachelor and postgraduate into one pot, and made it much more flexible for universities to move places around between courses than it was before. But almost at the same time, the previous government announced these short courses, which I think was, in my view, is not clearly supported by the funding legislation, where they say there'll be, they name the courses and name the number of places, And the current government's been even worse, not just naming the courses, but also saying must be occupied by particular groups of students. And so my worry is that we'll end up with a body that engages in overreach. And because we've got this recent experience with the block grants, I would say there need to be clear statutory limitations on the things that the Commission can do, or processes in place to limit them, in the sense of maybe you need to go back to Parliament to get this ticked off, to stop them doing just routinely things that shouldn't be done, rather than just in an emergency or something like that, having to do particular things that are not otherwise authorised by the Act. So, thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Andrew. Just before I bring Craig in, a question that's come up throughout the conference is around the people function. And Andrew puts his finger on it there. Is who will start this, or how will it be staffed? Tony, do you have a view on that?
This is where I say that's a matter for government. Look, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I've got 300 or so people in my higher education group in my department. It depends if government accepts that a tertiary education commission is something that is needed and that they believe should be established. There's various ways in which that commission can be established. They could be all entirely new, different people. They could be some of my people. They could be all of my people in terms of the work they've done around higher education. I don't want to be flippant, but it really is, at this stage, it will be a matter for government. But I think the point that both I've recognised in the report that Andrew's made as well is that there's a view that expertise is limited. So to enable the tech to operate well, if the government does decide to establish it, you'd want to look at ensuring that that expertise can be found and that expertise can be appointed, which may mean slightly different model to what you would normally see as a regular public service model. And there's ways that you can do that in terms of bringing people in, rotating people. You don't need to be permanent all the time, bringing people in from the sector, having them opportunities to work for 12 months or 2 years, go back into the sector. All those things are things that could be explored going forward.
Thank you, Tony. Craig, over to you.
Thanks. I'm going to limit my comments to a bit of a perspective from the vet sector, but also I'm interested in the administrative form that's being recommended out of the Accord. And if you want to see some evidence of potentially how expertise can dissipate out of a system, it was, 15 or so years ago now that the Commonwealth Government abolished ANTA, which was Australian National Training Authority, which was a sense across states and territories in the Commonwealth to bring that expertise together. There'd be enough people who have got history in the vet sector to say from that point on, that notion of expertise aggregation had been lost out of the system. What is quite interesting out of the National Skills Agreement that has just been struck is probably the first time where that aggregation has come back together. Let's think through this notion of the administrative form. It is probably good for us to reflect that in most forms of Commonwealth bureaucracy over the last 20 to 30 years, that vocational education and higher education have been in the one bureaucracy. But we've still got this challenge of tertiary, right? I think that's something we've got to try to think through, and which is why I'm a strong supporter of why we need to bring expertise together around the Tertiary Education Commission. I think the other broad comment about administrative form, and when you read the report, it's interesting for me to reflect back that my role with the Victorian Skills Authority, which is only really about 2 or 3 years old, has got very similar roles, being the point of aggregation, point of advice, point of collaboration, point of engagement, and the like. And it's no mistake potentially that the reviewer who established and recommended the Victorian Skills Authority, which was meant to be the Future Skills Commission, which included purchasing of places, was Jenny Macklin. So there's consistency in form there. And so that's actually been quite an effective function from my viewpoint about trying to bring these diverse perspectives to bear. Now, fundamentally, we're set up in Victoria to really help work and sort of guide provision of vocational education and training. But you've got to think about that in the context of our schooling system as well as our higher education system. So I do think there is this real value in bringing it together. In ATEC, I personally would give away the commissioning funding function and the pricing function to departments. They're the ones who have to go and fight for the budget. If it gave rise to us being able to really let's try to tackle as a country what is essentially oil and water between vet and higher education. And we know that the country is really yelling out to say, we've got these too many disjoins. Vet's seen as a second choice, and in some regards it deserves that reputation, given some of its history. But we've got to try to think through how can we bring, I think, really what is a coherent education pedagogical approach to what we need to be able to do. Because one thing we do know, it's not going to be craft-based skills that are going to be used for rebuilding our energy system. It's going to be trade, technician level workers alongside higher education workers, and there's a new blend or approach to what we need to be able to do. And on that basis, I think the TAFE Centres of Excellence, where Minister Clare talked about this quite strongly last night, is a real interesting catalyst point to really think about how can we drive this new model? How can it be our test bed for what the Tertiary Education Commission could look at in the future? And if we solve some of that, we've made pretty good strides actually, because Australia stands probably with 2 or 3 other countries that has a differentiated model for its vocational education and training system. It was right for the time in the 80s and 90s when we brought down the trade barriers, and we need to be able to make sure all of our workers had their skills recognised, but we're in a new world, and we need to be able to think about a new progressive education model that can give all people a chance to progress not only in their career, but to also to get good jobs.
Great, thank you very much. Tony and Andrew, you there got a strong endorsement of bringing the sectors together. So if you were looking at the size of that report, Tony, that you held up earlier, and you were looking at what might be, from a public sector point of view, a decade of sort of implementation, where does the text sit in terms of order of priority or sequence?
Obviously, many of the recommendations talk about the tech. So they talk about the tech as effectively being the enabler. Everything from the needs-based funding model right through. So it would make sense, again, if a government decides that a tech is something that they wish to establish, that would be early in the decade. It would have to be, otherwise the work couldn't be done. If a tech's established, obviously you'd have to work through a transition around what that looks like between departments, but also obviously what's happening or what's being recommended, by the panel in terms of techs or an ARC and what that would look like as well. But if a government decides that a commission is worthy of establishment, my view is that would be happening wouldn't be happening in year 10, that's for sure. It'd be happening in the front half of the implementation of the recommendations.
So maybe a supplementary to that, and it's set up, and maybe this is too difficult for you to answer at this point in time, Tony, but what the Accord report says about the tech, there is a huge amount of power there. There's a huge amount of potential fiscal power, perhaps with the accountability being held by the department or by Treasury. Is it realistic to see the tech holding that amount of power or having dare I say, a blank check?
I'll give you that matter for government answer on this one. Sorry, Francis. But this is what the Minister's been saying. Government will look at the recommendations, they'll look at the detail around it, and they'll be the ones who will determine what they think the role of tech will be and the powers of tech, which will be reflected then in the legislation, as Andrew said, which the Minister will be interested in introducing if the government makes decisions around the tech itself. So, sorry, mate, I can't help you with that one. But good try.
So, Andrew...
I'll have a go at that one.
Okay, Andrew, over to you.
So obviously government will always set the budget parameters. It's kind of a fundamental thing they have to do. But I had to give a paper late last year on the 1957 Murray report, which led to a very significant increase in Commonwealth expenditure in higher education. And it was actually quite interesting because there was clearly in 57, there was clearly strong resistance in the Liberal Party to that level of spending. and the Prime Minister, Menzies, had to really push it through, use all his authority to get it through. The committee had actually recommended a university grants committee. Menzies instead went for a commission, the first of, it wasn't actually the first universities commission, but the first one that's kind of like this one. And what that did was put out all these sophisticated reports, which I think set the benchmark of what was required. And for Menzies, like, what he was doing was creating a system that would outlast his authority in the Liberal Party. So you actually see between when he retires in 66 and when Labor comes to power in 72, spending about doubles from successive later Liberal Prime Ministers. And I think part of this is that commission set the benchmark, and the government had to explain why it wasn't going to do these carefully argued recommendations. And I think the commission here, while obviously there will still be times when the government says no, it will be setting the benchmark of what is required, and that will create political momentum.
What prospect do you think that the Accord, or indeed the Tertiary Education Commission, having heard Sarah Henderson this morning, what prospect do you think that this will have cross-party support?
I would say that if you took the Liberal Party of the 80s or 90s, they wouldn't like this kind of interventionist approach. But I think now, partly because there is distrust of the higher education sector that's developed in the Liberal Party, they may well go for it because it'll give them potentially more power. And this is kind of where it might end. It might start with what we've got in this report, but the legislation could obviously be changed, and a future government may decide, well, the Commission can do X, Y, and Z, but it can't fund this list of courses that we think are a waste of time and won't lead to employment.
But then that brings us back to one of your points in your blog, and your opening comment is around the risk of over-intervention. And there could be a risk here that certain parts of the Accord are front-loaded, but the financial incentives are never quite coming. But let's wait and see. Craig, any comment on this debate?
In terms of the intervention?
The intervention or the cross-party support that might be needed?
I think that through when obviously governments will be thinking about where are their votes in marginals, and I still think it plays out that it's the aspiring trade workers for their kids in outer suburbs and the like. So in some respects, this plays into that hand, right? People who have taken a big sacrifice in their life, they've done all these things out of trade training, and they've got aspirations for their children. They want that to play out through either a TAFE or university. So I think it can play well to the electorate, and that I think that would play out well.
Thank you, Craig. So now we're going to turn to the questions. So I'm going to be, this is a bit like going back to the optician for an eye test. So it's a sort of stretching because the font is a slightly grey size on a white backdrop. So the first question is, it is interesting and unexpected to see a panel discussing this topic. Please comment on the role of diversity in EdTech. Now, before I pass to the panel to discuss the diversity in the tech, can I just say on behalf of Universities Australia, we did actually discuss this when we met with Universities Australia on the preparatory session, and despite the best efforts of University Australia, they did actually have a more diverse panel, but something fell through. So if I can, on behalf of Universities Australia, give that explanation and apologise, but it was raised by the panel. But can I pass the comment on the role of diversity in EdTech? Tony?
I mean, obviously that's going to be important. And thank you, Francis. We all did raise that. We're all, well, speak for myself, all white blokes on the panel. But as Francis explained, the UA responded to that. In terms of the structure that I showed you before, it talked about the diversity of commissioners, First Nation commissioners, commissioners that would have a very strong focus on equity, but also the breadth of experiences of people that are part not just of the governance, but also in the organisation itself. So that's something, if the organisation is formed, that would be basically a requirement, I think, that the government would set in terms of board representation, but also then in terms of the management of the organisation, equity and diversity of those people working in that organisation will be really important.
We have another question coming in, which is what international model is the government likely to examine in determining the shape of Australia's TEC? Now, this was a lively debate amongst the Vice-Chancellors on Monday, and some who were experienced in the English system talked about the migration from the Higher Education Funding Council for England to what many people thought was the dreaded Office for Students. Is there an international model that you have in mind? Because I know that some people have also cited the New Zealand model as perhaps being more apt to Australia.
Sorry, that's me?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, to some degree that was the work of the panel rather than the work of the government in a sense. And the panel did talk about things like the New Zealand model and the Hong Kong model and then proposed what that model would look like in their recommendation. They've been quite detailed around what that would be, its functions, its governance, its board membership, so they've really done that. Obviously, as you would expect the department, we will now provide advice to government as we would normally do about, well, here's one proposal from the panel, this is what other models look like, and we are looking at internationally. We're not looking at one in particular, we're looking at a range of commissions that operate across the world, what we would perceive as being the strengths and weaknesses, the extent and the reach of those commissions, and that will form kind of advice that goes to government. But we're not focusing on one particular country in terms of some of the examination that we're doing at the moment, Francis. But we are interested in views, and people have already got views out there about don't go down this track, and we are listening to that. Remembering, of course, the panel also recommended that there's an implementation committee that would be formed to provide advice to government as well. So it won't just be the department. The implementation committee, which the Minister will make determination on in the not too distant future, will go into a lot more detail around some of these things, including, I'm sure, the structure, the form and the legislation if a tertiary education commission is established.
The risk here, I think, and what's lying behind that question is around the implementation and the culture. And Andrew, you touched on this as well. And earlier, Michael Wells gave me a quote from about a previous commission about the risk of it being Moscow and on the Mongala, that it's over-interventionist. How do you think you could guard against getting the culture wrong here by looking at international examples or experiences?
Look, I don't know how you would do that, but if you don't want this to overreach, you don't set it up in the first place. In some ways, stop the monster ever living.
Is it a monster?
Well, it could be. My reading of the report, as I read it on the weekend, is it's not a monster in the minds of the Accord panel, but it may well be a monster by the time it's legislated and taken over by someone who's got a very fixed view of what the sector should look like and all these kind of issues. So. But as I said in my presentation, you can put clear statutory limitations on what it can do, or only do things in special circumstances, emergencies, COVID kind of thing, and that will put some constraints on, I think, the culture and definitely on the practice of the Commission.
And what component from the sector would you like to see in the TEC in terms of its people makeup?
Well, personally, I'd like to see a lot of higher ed people in it. But I think this kind of rotation idea as well is also good, so that people in the universities can see the kind of constraints that government agencies work under, but also that that people working in government can see what it looks like on the ground. And sometimes we do see at least first draft proposals of policies that just do not reflect the practical realities of implementation.
Craig, let me go to the second question down, because it's raising dual sector universities already exist and succeed with many of the ambitions to bring the sectors together. What's to be learned or expected from the dual sector institutions?
It's a great question. So formally there are 6 dual sectors in the country, but there are many universities, of course, that have vocational education and training operations as well, right? So for a variety of reasons. I think we can learn a lot from the dual sectors, because at various points in time they do struggle with bringing the instruments of VET and higher education together, and whether that's the instrument of learning, the instrument of accreditation, the instrument of funding and accountability. So I think they're a really interesting real-life testbed of actually how could we approach this in a way that can free up a lot of that cost, really, and it's a cost to the institution, But fundamentally, it's a cost to the student trying to navigate these complexities that are brought about by well-intentioned designed policies, but they operate in silos. And so this is where I think, use them as a really interesting point of examination, test bed to try out new approaches that can then spread further across the tertiary sector, would be my view.
Is that something you recognise at the moment, Tony?
Yeah, and this dual sector was very closely engaged with Mary and the panel around the work that they do, where they see the strengths and the weaknesses of the system at the moment. If we do want to move towards what the panel's recommending in the long run about a truly tertiary education system, we have to learn from those dual sectors. We also have to look at the vet sector more broadly. You will see there's recommendations in there about looking at how CSPs, for example, could be more available to the vet sector. There's a recommendation in there around in the report. Unpacking those things and looking at what that looks like in the future will be a key role in terms of how we can bring those two sectors together more closely.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Craig. Andrew, maybe if there's a question coming up around Texas independence and it being potentially under this new structure a mirage, what would you view with regards to the relationship between TEXA and the ATEC going forward?
But there are a couple of complexities there, because one is there are still about 50 or 60 non-uni providers that aren't part of the funding system at all, and a larger number who only have fee help access. And the fact they've actually got, 6-7% of enrolments means that what they are doing will actually impact the Commission's global view of what's happening, but the Commission won't have any control over them because TEXA is the only agency interacting with them. I think that putting in the Commission could actually improve some coherence. So we had this issue in the previous government where they accepted the cold rate recommendations to basically increase the research requirement to be a university. At the same time, the government also cut a whole lot of research funding out of the teaching grant, basically making it harder and harder for some universities to actually achieve half their disciplines having research as well. And so I think putting them together will make for a more coherent policy framework. Look, I think it could still maintain its independence. I'm not sure why they would try and control TEXA. They actually want to expand the system, and TEXA's actually been reasonably good at increasing the number of providers in the system.
Tony, does the department have a view at this stage?
That's a matter for government. Again, if you read the report, it talks about the TEXA legislation would remain, the TEXA Commissioner still has, or Chief Commissioner I should say, will still have all of their legislative responsibility, and the board itself will have its legislative responsibilities. So in the initial stage, the panel certainly doesn't have a view that TEXA becomes, dare I say, subsumed and all of its functions suddenly become, the authority of the actual ATEC board more broadly. But, the only comment I'll make, and it's for others to decide, is there's a funding role for the Commission, funding and regulation, and also what's happening around research and the mix of all those things, and what does that look like in the long term? And again, that'll be a matter that will be worked through, I guess, by government over the coming months, and also what the legislation looks like. I saw there was a question, I jumped down. There was a question about how can things survive if they're not legislated, I think, survive election cycles. The view of the government would be that if Commission is established, it would be legislated. It'll be a notion of an independent statutory authority, would have legislation behind it, which would outline their roles and functions and all the bits and pieces that go with that as well.
There's a second question there down which says, arguably the department and TEXA are not properly resourced. Why will
Couldn't agree more, sorry.
Why will this be different if ATEC is established? Andrew or Craig for an independent view?
Well, there's no guarantee, is there? And that's kind of one of the issues that I raised in my criticisms of the feasibility, that the department has had endless so-called efficiency dividends, which I actually call inefficiency dividends, because basically it means that everything is delayed because the department doesn't have the resources to do the job. And so again, this is kind of why systems that are sort of more autonomous and they're running like the demand-driven system do have funding cuts, but they've still got that basic self-governing capacity and aren't reliant on a single commission or single department to keep it going.
I'm going to be a little bit obtuse in this response, but I do wonder, sitting back and reflecting what's going across, for example, Julian Hill's report about the employment services model, what's been playing out in vocational education and training. I wonder whether the government is trying to think about a different way of governing provision that is not as dependent upon market settings and student choice, but we don't quite know what that is. And I reckon this is problems faced by all countries around the world that have swallowed the neoliberalism pill, and they don't know where to go to next. And I suspect that this government is much the same. Because remember, part of the problem we have, while we have to have heavy regulators, is because we've pushed out things to the market. A couple of things might go wrong on the side. Oh, we've got a quality problem, so we've got to intervene. If you can provision a bit better from the top, from the top sounds a bit like planning on the Moscow. What is it? Planning,
Moscow on the long globe.
Moscow on the long globe.
Yeah.
But at least that can then have a bit of rationale about, making sure that we fund the right institutional form, set them up so they can be self-managing, they can have quality aspirations and the like, and you should be able to lift the regulatory load is perhaps part of the mix in here.
So greater stability from ATEC as a valuable contribution. The question, I suppose, from a public policy point of view, and if you were to go into that question about under-resourced in the sector and the department and the public funding, if we add ATEC, what do we take away? What do we stop?
That's a very good question. Is that to me?
I sound like a bit like a Thatcherite there, I'm not, but what is it in terms of public policy? Because this is huge provision. So I know it's touching back a little bit on the first question, which is around, do you see 15, 20% of the department shifting over? But this is so comprehensive that you would be asking, if you're looking at finite resources, then what is it that's stopped in this?
I mean, obviously, you can't have duplication. That makes no sense at all. So you can't have a department that's doing the exact same thing that a commission is doing if a commission is established. Sorry that I keep saying if a commission is established, but I'll keep saying that. And it may not be immediate as well. The commission can't, if the commission is established, it won't turn on immediately, I can't imagine, overnight. And so there'll be transition periods around all these sort of things. It'll be ultimately up to government as to what they decide if a commission's established, what the commission actually does. It may not accept all the recommendations in terms of the range of things that the panel's recommending the commission might do, and so there may still be a place for things that are being done by the department which is not being done by the commission and vice versa. But ultimately, again, this will be, while I think the report talks about the commission doing teaching and learning policy, research policy, international policy, funding policy. There's not much left to some degree, but there are new functions that that the commission would do that the department doesn't currently do, and so there's there are some differences around that, but there's also many things that we would currently do that if a commission is established, the department would no longer do. And so again, they're the things that we will work through with government as to what the commission does. But I think fundamentally, as everyone would accept, you can't have two different bodies doing the exact same thing. It would make no sense at all.
But the department would retain a role in higher education as the advisor to the minister?
Potentially, matter for government.
So that but you could envisage that shifting also to the Tertiary Education Commission?
Well, look, potentially. I mean, in my portfolio, I've got a range of statutory authorities, and it doesn't mean I don't give any advice on the advice that they give. Of course I do. The minister rings me sometimes and says, what's your view on what has come from this particular statutory authority? And so that's my role. But the notion of me having 300 people that are going to provide advice on what a commission might do, that probably is not real.
We had early commissions before we had an education portfolio. Used to be in Prime Minister and Cabinet, so didn't have an education minister until 1966.
So what would you envisage stopping, Andrew?
Stopping in the department, or
across government? If you're introducing this, what from a public expenditure point of view would you say? How do you finance the Tertiary Education Commission?
Well, TEXA levies charges on its providers, so maybe this will do the same. I shouldn't have said that. It's put an idea out there, but
CFOs take note. Not government policy, to be clear.
Yeah, I think it's going to be the hard part. And given that we're a finite pot of money, there's going to be really hard priorities about setting, and The loan scheme, I think one sort of thing this is not very deep on is its interaction with the loan scheme, which really is an enormous part of the system. Like it's shooting more than $7 billion a year out the door, and that really is a major government cash flow and cost issue. It's sort of at the edges with the student contribution issue, but there's separate stuff about the repayments, which I think have a big effect on the overall economics of higher education.
Thank you. Moving down then, we have, will ATEC play a role in determining public funding priorities between research and teaching? Craig?
I'm probably the least qualified to respond on that, but again, if you're going to give it a function around pricing, you're going to have to deal with the source of funding for research, I guess. So maybe it is bring some expertise together to finally try to crack that nut.
And
like it does have this interesting comment, which it doesn't elaborate on, that there should be some research money left in the per student funding rate, which I actually agree with. I know it's inconsistent with sort of the excellence and industry engagement kind of a research agenda, but while we've still got so many academics on a teaching and research employment model, the funding system has to reflect that in some way. Because unless you've got some kind of plan to destroy the NTEU and rip up all these teaching and research contracts, this needs to be maintained in some way, and having totally separate teaching and research funding pots makes it very difficult.
And what does it mean for the, say, ARC and the Margaret Shield Review? What is this? So we had a question earlier around TEXA and whether in this new framework TEXA is a mirage. What does this mean for the Research Council?
Is it a question about whether they're going to lose some power? I don't know. Look, I really don't know.
So the ARC legislation's in the Senate now.
Yeah.
So the legislation will be debated and the government would hope passed in the not too distant future. And so that role will continue. In terms of ARC, again, like TEXA, the panel has said that the legislative responsibilities, including legislative responsibilities of the newly established ARC board, will continue. The board's not being subsumed into the ATEC board. And so I think the government would have a view and the minister would have a view that legislation that is introduced into the House, 2 weeks later, he doesn't want that legislation not to be worth the paper that it's written on. And so I'm not concerned about the great work that Margaret and her panel did in relation to ARC.
So you see it as being ring-fenced from...
Which is what the panel says. The panel says, to be fair. The panel does talk about that quite clearly and supports the recommendations from that review and also the legislation that's currently before the House.
So government, you wouldn't see this process encroaching, if I were to go back to Andrew's area, around how these powers might be used? Because you're setting up a Tertiary Education Commission, or the proposal is to set it up with quite significant powers. Over time, there's a disequilibrium.
Yeah. What happens over time, perhaps in successive governments, I guess, is a bit hard to project. But just back to that earlier question, there's a few sub-questions in that question about what we mean about kind of funding priorities. Obviously, the Commission, if it's established, has been given the task of looking at basically a pricing mechanism, picking up on Andrew's point about where does research fit in terms of actually being part of that teaching component in terms of courses, looking at really what is the true cost of delivering courses and teaching courses, both in individual courses, but more broadly, depending on campuses and where you are across Australia. So that's a piece of work they've been asked to do. In terms of research, ARC, of course, will continue to have their research grants. That work will continue, and again, the legislation will reflect some of those things. But the government of the day may also have other priorities that they bring in as they do. And so whether the government of the day brings that into ATEC and asks ATEC to respond to that, or whether they do that individually, again, will be a matter for government as, elections come around, election commitments are made, election promises are made. We've all been through that particular cycle. But I think ATEC, if established, will have certainly a role around pricing, around funding, and there will be an intersection, I would imagine, between research in some way as well as teaching more broadly.
Andrew, do you want to come?
No.
So let's go to the next question, Craig. I'm going to pass that to you. What issues do the panel see around the highly federated nature of VET TAFE sector and the centralised nature of the university sector in the context of ATEC? Does this matter? Does this make them irreconcilable?
I don't think so. Noting that in the report, it says one of the first things is to actually look at the proposed new AQF. And I think that gives a frame to start to think about what is the nature of learning that's required at various points for career outcomes, but also for career progression, and where does that best happen between vocational education, training and higher education. So I think that's the way to sort of start the story. States have a big role, of course, because they are concerned about local economic development as well as communities that are at risk of being left behind. So they have real skin in the game to be able to make sure that this works, and whether it would then help them to work collaboratively across universities and TAFE, which are sort of informed by the AQF, and the ATEC could free some of those barriers that play out from different funding systems and the like. And I think what Jobs and Skills Australia are showing is we've just got so much data at our disposal now that you can actually, that solves what has been a coordination problem in the past. You've got data that's readily available to you. So it comes back to Andrew's point about the centrality of data to be able to help guide change, but also equally keep track of change.
Thank you, Craig. So we have time for one more question, so I'm going to take this one. An important role for the TEC is to encourage the emergence of new types of providers, presumably because it makes no sense just to double the size of existing universities. How would a TEC do that, Andrew?
Well, this will be part of the deep planning that it does. So it'll have to, really look across Australia, work out where the likely demand is to come from, and then work out what are the capacities of the institutions already there, and to the extent they're lacking, actually develop new institutions, which are appropriate to the likely demand from that sector. Like, we could do a lot more now, like what are the existing university catchment areas, what is the population growth, just very crude sensibility. It's pretty clear most of it's in the outer suburbs of the big cities. One point I made several times over the last 12 months is, from the 40s to the 90s, we create new universities in every decade to meet new demand. Every new public university, not a single one this century. That's historically weird, given we've had enormous growth in enrolments this year. And I think one of the big issues is, can we, which is implied by the question, can we keep having 50, 60, 70,000 student universities and these places be, not alienating and properly attractive to the students?
Tony, do you have an ideal size of a university in mind?
No.
Andrew?
Look, I think for certain types of students, a smaller, more intimate environment makes a massive difference. If you're an online student not interacting anyway, it doesn't matter if there are 50,000 other people also enrolled in that online institution. So I don't think there is any one answer, but we do need a diversity of institutions.
Okay, final question, very quick fire to each of you, starting with Craig. Have you more hope for the TEC or more fear for the TEC?
Far more hope for the TEC because it brings expertise together.
Thank you, Craig. Andrew?
Fear.
Fear. Tony?
That's a matter for government.
So, colleagues, on your behalf, can I thank Craig, Andrew and Tony for joining us today. It's really, really very difficult to unpack some of this because the Accord, as you know, just came out over the weekend. But I do want to thank them for their honesty and for giving us an insight into their thinking. But on your behalf, thank you very much.